In this module, we will cover developing modular automation using procedures and quick calls. A procedure is a callable set of steps that can be reused. Each procedure can have a set of inputs called arguments and a set of outputs called return values. Anytime you find yourself reusing code or copying and pasting blocks of steps, you should consider using a procedure instead. Using procedures can make your automation effort faster and easier. Procedures are reusable, saving you development and debugging time every time you use one. They make your test cases more readable by replacing large sections with a single descriptive call. Procedures enable collaboration by making it easy for a team to contribute to different parts of a project and use others' work. Finally, they make maintenance easier. If a commonly used procedure needs to be changed, those changes will automatically be applied to any test case that calls it. To create a new procedure, use the Insert button on the Test Case Editor toolbar, or right-click and choose Insert Procedure. Use the Procedure Properties menu to set descriptions, create arguments, and define the response. Procedures can be created in an existing test case or in a separate procedure library. Arguments are used to pass information to procedures. They are found in the Procedure Properties menu. If an argument is required for the procedure to run, check "This argument is required" so that an error is displayed if the user does not provide a value. Alternatively, you can specify a default value to be used if the user does not supply a value when they call the procedure. Arguments become local variables within the procedure. Each procedure, including the main procedure of any test case, has its own variable namespace. This means that variables created in one procedure are not accessible by another. Use arguments and return values to pass information between procedures. By default, a procedure will return nothing. However, it is often necessary for the procedure to perform steps and return information. For most responses, use the Response section in the Procedure Properties menu to create a standardized JSON response. This response will generate default queries, making for an easy and predictable way to read the response in a test case. For more complex responses, you may create a JSON string using the JSON step action, or build any other string using Python or Tcl eval steps. A procedure can use a return step action to populate the response of the calling step with these strings. A return step stops executing the current procedure and returns execution from the current procedure to the caller. The return value is determined by the contents of the description field for the return step. Procedures can be added to an existing test case if they are going to be used only in that test case. To create procedures to be used by other test cases, create a procedure library file. Procedure libraries are the same file type as a test case, .fftc, but they are configured to allow the procedures they contain to be called by other test cases. Create a procedure library by creating a new test case file, then selecting the Procedure Library checkbox in the General page. Although a procedure call can be manually entered into the description field in the test case editor, you might find it easier to use the Procedure Call wizard. To access the wizard, create a call step, click in the description field, and click the ellipse button that appears in the far right of that field. Here you can select the library file and the procedure you want to execute, and fill in the needed arguments. The wizard will build the correct syntax and insert it into your step. Quick calls are special procedures that are tied to a particular session profile. They create custom actions for a session. Every session has built-in action steps, like command in SSH sessions and click in Selenium sessions. When you create a quick call for a session, it extends that session's action command set. This makes it very easy to reuse quick calls in test cases and also in manual sessions. Quick calls remove device-specific commands and responses from a test case and enable you to reuse a test case across many different devices. They allow us to write one test case file regardless of how many different devices we need to test. Here is an example of a quick call that handles shutting down an interface. The DUT session has an action called Disable Interface that runs all the steps you see on the left. The test case itself doesn't need to know the commands used to shut down an interface on this particular device. Quick calls should be named based on the function they perform. Remember, the goal of using quick calls is to abstract a device's commands and responses from the test case. These commands will be different from device to device, and quick calls can replace many individual commands. In the example shown here, the quick calls are named Get Chassis Info instead of Show Chassis Firmware, and Disable and Enable Interface rather than Shutdown and No Shutdown. Quick calls are procedures with a special configuration. They are stored in quick call libraries. What separates quick calls from regular procedures is that they are configured to work with a particular session type on a particular device family. Each quick call library will link to a reference session profile, and any session that uses that session profile will have access to the quick calls stored in the library. Quick call libraries should be stored in the Session Profiles folder in a device project. Name the quick call library the same as the base session profile using quick call library or qclib at the end of the file name. To call a quick call, you don't use a call step like you do for a regular procedure. Remember, when we build quick calls, we are extending the action set for a session. To use a quick call, set the session tag for the session you want to interact with and choose the quick call from the action drop-down menu. You can then use the procedure call wizard to fill in arguments just like a regular procedure. Our test case has a lot of device-specific commands in it. If we wanted to reuse this test case on something other than a Juniper, say a Cisco, we would have to write an entirely different test case. Our goal here is to abstract all of the device-specific information from this test case using a quick call library so that we will be able to run this test on a different device. So let's take a look at our Juniper device project. We have a base session profile already. If I open that up and go to the settings page, I see this option here to link the session profile to a quick call library. If I click this Create Quick Call Library link, I can easily create a new quick call library. I'm going to name this Junos Telnet Quick Call Library. And when I click Finish, the new quick call library file is going to be opened. So you can see that we're storing that right here in the Session Profiles folder of the Juniper device project. If I go back to my Juniper base session profile, I can see that it is now pointing to that quick call library file. And if I look at the general page of the quick call library, I can see that the quick call library is denoted as a quick call library, and it's also pointing to the base session profile. Now this may look like just a regular test case file, and it is. It has an FFTC file extension. It has the same steps page that we've been using in our test case. The only difference is that this is associated with our base session profile. Let's go back to our test case and take a look at which quick calls we'll need to create in order to remove the device-specific commands from the test case. I can see that I'm doing a command here called Show Chassis Firmware to get the current firmware version of our device under test. I'm doing an interface check, so show interface is brief, and I'm also shutting down and re-enabling an interface. So that's going to be 3 different quick calls we're going to create. Let's start with the first command we have in our test case, show chassis firmware. I'm going to go back to the quick call library, and we're going to create a new procedure. I'm going to right click, choose Insert, and Insert Procedure. I'm going to name this procedure Get Chassis Info. Now I know that this procedure does not require any inputs. Right? If we look at the command here, We don't need to give it an interface name or an IP address or any kind of input. I do know that there's going to be an output though. We're going to have to return the firmware version back to the test case. So if I click on the procedure title, come down here to the bottom right corner of the screen, I can check my procedure properties, and that's where I can define my inputs and outputs. So in our case, we don't have any inputs, so no arguments, but we are going to have some response. So if I click on response, I can click this checkbox here, enable JSON response. This is going to allow us to return the info we need in a nice structured way. There's a key value pair here. I'm going to change the name of this key to firmware version. Value I can leave alone. This is just going to be the default text that is returned if no actual information is returned in this key. So this value text is going to be replaced by the actual firmware version that the quick call returns. If I scroll up, I can see a sample of what the response is going to look like. The reason we do this JSON response is so that it's standardized between different quick calls. We always know that we can count on having a nice structured key with the same key names from device to device as we go forth in our development. So now we're ready to add the command to the quick call. So I'm just going to copy the step from the test case and just paste it into the quick call here. All right, so a couple things to look at. We can see that the session tag here has changed. When we copied it, it was for the .dot session. Now it's using session in square brackets. And you might recall from an earlier module that session is a reserved variable. What this means is just issue this command to the session that's defined as the default for this quick call library. Now, which session is that? If we look at our general tab, it's our Juniper Telnet base session. So using this information, the quick call knows that we're going to issue this command to an SSH session and that it's going to be available to our Juniper session profile. All right, so if we look at this analysis rule, we have a query. This is saying, give me the first software version in the table. We can leave that alone because that's still going to work here. The response map is going to work here just like it did in the test case. However, if we look at our assert statement, we have a when true and when false. And within those, we're passing the test and failing the test. We don't want to do any pass-fail analysis inside of a quick call. The goal of the quick call is to return the information to the test case and let the test case decide what to do with it. Remember that this procedure, this quick call, is going to be reused in many test cases going forward. We don't know exactly what those test cases are going to want to do with this information. So let's just let the test case decide if it's a pass or a fail. To do that, we're going to change this assert to a store. What this does by default is store the information in this query in a local variable. Now that could be useful in a test case, could even be useful in a quick call if you need to reuse this information later. But all we're interested in doing is returning this query back to the test case. So let's take a look at the properties menu. You can see now it's called processor properties because I'm looking at an analysis rule processor. I have a couple options here. I can store this as a variable, but I can also store it as a response value. So we're not interested in storing it as a variable in this case, so I'm just going to uncheck this box and check the response value box. Now I need to insert a return key here. So if you remember what you named your firmware version return key, you could type that here, or you can click this little ellipse button. and it'll give you all the options that you have. So firmware version, that's what we defined it as. I'm going to select that and click OK. And now this analysis rule, instead of passing or failing the test, is going to just return that firmware version back to the test case. Now we're ready to modify our test case to use this quick call instead of the device-specific command. I'm going to save my quick call library, and that's going to update the actions that are available to our DUT session in our test case. So now I can go back to the test case, and if I hit the drop down here, we're going to change command to get chassis info. I can now delete this command from the description field. And let's just take a look at the analysis rule that's attached to this step. We have a query here that refers to the table map that we built for the original response from the device. Now I know that we're not going to actually see that response here in the test case. And if I look in the response view down here in the bottom left corner, I can see an approximation of what the response is going to look like to this quick call. This is our key value pair that we defined, right? So we're going to replace this old query with a new one that's going to grab whatever information is dropped into this value string here. And that query is just going to be firmware version, just like that. So whatever your key name is, it's just the key name followed by an open and closed parentheses. So now whatever's in here is going to be the answer to this query, and I can actually just leave my assert statement alone. It's still going to do the same actions based on whatever comes out of this response instead of what's coming from the response directly from the device. So we're done with our get chassis info quick call. Let's see what other quick calls we need to make. We need to do one to replace this show interfaces brief step. So I'm going to go to my quick call library. I'm going to make a new procedure. And this one's going to be called get interface status. Now this quick call is going to have a response just like get chassis info, but it's also going to have an input. So let's go ahead and define that. If I go to the properties menu down here at the bottom right of my screen, I can see the procedure properties for this procedure that I am highlighting. So let's go to arguments. We're going to add an argument, and we're going to call it interface name. I'm going to enable this checkbox saying this argument is required. We can't run the quick call without supplying the interface name. So we want to communicate that to our users. We're not going to give it a default value because we want the user to supply the interface name every time they run this quick call. Always a good idea to leave a nice description for anyone that's going to come across this quick call in the future. So name of interface to get status on as seen on the device. All right. Now I'm ready to define the output. So let's click on response here. And for this quick call, we're going to return two things. So first, I'm going to enable the JSON response. And I'm going to scroll down. And the first key we're going to need is called admin status. I'm going to click this add child button. And the second key we're going to need is link status. All right, so now we're going to go back to our test case and just copy this command and paste it right here. Just like before, that session tag has been replaced with the default session variable. Looking at our command, we have a reference to the variable that exists in our test case. Now this primary interface name variable is not going to exist in this quick call. Variables only exist in the procedure that you create them in. So here, in the test case, we're creating this variable called primary interface name, but it's not going to exist here. We're going to pass that information in via argument, and our argument is called interface name. So I'm just going to replace this with the same name that we defined for our argument. So when you pass an argument into a quick call, it creates a variable in the procedure, in the quick call procedure. And that variable is referenced in the same way that any other variable is referenced in a test case. So we're going to sub this out for the name that we pass in as the interface name. And that's how we use our argument. Let's take a look at the analysis rule. So similar to before, we have a query for physical status. We're still interested in that, right? But we don't want to do any pass-fail analysis in our quick call. So looking at here, again, we're doing an assert, and we're doing a pass or a fail depending on what the interface status is. Now, of course, a future test case could be looking for this to be down in some cases. In fact, our test case is looking for it to be down in one step, right? After we shut down the interface, we want the interface to be down. So we're not going to pass or fail the test here. We're going to let the test case pass or fail based on the information that we return to it. So just like before, we're going to change this assert to a store. And we are going to come to the properties menu and uncheck variable and check response value. Going to hit the ellipse button over here and pick the link status return value. Now we don't have an analysis rule to return the admin status yet, but we'll come back to that later. We are ready to replace all the show interfaces brief commands in our test case with a call to this quick call. So I'm going to save my quick call library, go back to my test case, and let's find anywhere that we are looking for that interface status and use the quick call instead of the command to the device. So here, click the drop down just as we did before, and we're going to change this to get interface status. Now this requires an argument, right? We defined the interface name as a required argument. So I can see here that we have an error, and if I just hover my mouse over that error, it's going to tell us exactly what we're missing. So required argument interface name is not given. If we click over here in the ellipse button in the description field of the step, we're going to get a little form that tells us exactly what the quick call needs in order to run. So we need this interface name. What I'm going to do is give it the local variable that we have in the test case and pass that in. So if I click away, that error is going to go away. And now I can see that we are passing in the value of our primary interface name variable, which is going to be the name of the port that we have in our topology, and I'm passing that in with an argument named interface name. Let's take a look at the analysis rule that's attached to this step. So this query, physical status, isn't going to work. This is applied to the response directly from the device. Now, because we're getting a response from this quick call, we're going to use link status, as we can see there. So I'm just going to change this query to link status, and now This assert statement should still work just like it did before. As long as the link status here is up, it's going to pass the test. And we're going to basically just do the same thing for each of these steps here. So I'm going to replace my command action with a get interface status action. And I can actually just copy and paste this argument in the other steps. Take a look at our query. We're going to change this from physical status to link status. And there's one more step that we have to change. And that's basically how you're going to create every quick call you need going forward. We have a couple more device-specific commands in our test case, so we're going to create some quick calls to handle those. So I'm just going to quickly make those. We're going to create a quick call for disable interface and one for enable interface. So you'll notice that I'm doing the edit interfaces for both quick calls. Typically, you're going to want to enter and exit config mode if you need to in each quick call. You don't want to leave the state of the config mode you're in ambiguous at all. The test case shouldn't have to make assumptions as to which state the device is in. There is a need to add the exit command for the config mode that we're in here, but I'm using an emulated version of Juniper that doesn't have that, so that's why you don't see it here. Anyway, back in our test case, I can replace these commands with the quick calls. If you take a look at our test case now, you can see that there are no longer any device-specific commands or responses in here. So this test case is completely device agnostic. If we have a different device, we can build another quick call library for that device, give it the same quick calls, and then this test case will run with either. And that's what we're going to do in the next module.